Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a profoundly rare and I think really powerful set of source materials. We're looking at the diary entries, private correspondence, and the intimate reflections of a man who really in the span of just 2 years moved from a position of comfortable discretion to become one of the most visible, challenging moral figures of the late 20th century.
Óscar Romero.
The Archbishop of San Salvador.
And that trajectory you just mentioned, from 1978 to 1980, is precisely the mission of this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're using these deeply personal notes and contemporary testimonies to try and understand how Monsignor Romero, he entered the archbishopric known for his quiet, serene character and a reputation for being, frankly, a conservative.
Yeah, a safe choice.
A very safe choice. And how he was so radically forged in the fire of El Salvador's brutal repression and the onset of civil conflict. We want to understand how he became, as the source materials call him, a referent of bravery, and maybe more hauntingly, why his voice wanted to be silenced.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately, because the core theme here isn't about political maneuvering, is it? It's about a spiritual duty that gets translated into public action.
Exactly.
Romero made a very deliberate, conscious choice to announce the word of God, not as a quiet retreat, not as a refuge from the world's conflict, but as a driving, unyielding force meant to challenge violence head-on. Our sources lay out this central conflict with just stunning clarity, asserting that in times of war and widespread, systematized human rights violations, all the grand discourses of the left or the right become useless masks.
And that phrase, useless masks, is so central to his entire philosophy during this period.
So powerful.
It really is.
Yeah.
What he realized, what he wrote in his reflections, was that when society devolves into mass killing and generalized terror ideologies, they just cease to matter. They become rhetorical cover for cruelty.
Right.
What remained, the only thing that remained, was the intrinsic, God-given worth of every single human life.
The dignity that each person possesses.
That's the quote. And this evangelical focus is really the key to understanding why his position was so unique and ultimately so threatening.
What's fascinating here is that he wasn't speaking ideology. He wasn't a politician. He was speaking a prophetic conscience informed by the gospel. And that conscience, it knew no borders.
Absolutely. The documents show his oratory reflected this borderless mission. His weekly sermons weren't aimed at one demographic or political faction. They went out across the airwaves to everyone.
Everyone.
To the campesinos and laborers who desperately sought solace, protection, and justice. But equally, they went to the powerful. The businessmen, the military personnel, the children, the elders. I mean, he reached the entire nation every Sunday.
So for the humble, that voice was solace. It was an affirmation of their dignity. But for the powerful.
For the powerful, that voice was a constant, inescapable questioning.
And that's what made him so dangerous to the established order.
Precisely. His position wasn't about aligning the church with one side of the escalating political spectrum. It was about calling all sides back to basic human dignity. And by doing that, he created a moral space above the war, positioning himself as this formidable moral authority that you couldn't just dismiss as a leftist or communist or revolutionary.
He challenged the very foundational moral assumptions of the Salvadoran elite and the state apparatus they controlled.
He really did.
Okay, so let's jump into 1978. This is the year he really establishes this hardline pastoral stance. And we see right away that this wasn't just about impassioned preaching. It was about building physical, structural support systems for the persecuted.
That commitment was immediate, and it required tangible action. The first structural response we see in the sources is Romero overseeing the establishment of the Socorro Jurídico.
The legal aid office.
The legal aid office, yeah. This was initially set up in the Estrenado of San Jose, and it was designed to process and document the relentless daily influx of human rights cases, disappearances, tortures, murders.
And the sources are incredibly specific about the scale of the human tragedy, noting that Socorro Jurídico was tragically but realistically described as impotent. That word is so loaded.
It is. But it wasn't impotent due to a lack of will. It was impotent because of a complete breakdown of the rule of law. I mean, when you have a military and security structure operating with total impunity, the legal framework is irrelevant. The lawyers knew they couldn't win the cases, but their mission was to document, to witness, and to create an indisputable record for history and for international bodies.
So the documentation itself became a political act.
It was often the last line of defense for a victim's memory.
And it also put the legal team in incredible personal danger.
Absolutely. Yet, facing that overwhelming need, Romero specifically called for a permanent legal team of committed professionals. and the response was enthusiastic. It showed this profound faith in his leadership. Nearly 20 people, a mix of established lawyers and dedicated law students, answered the call, led by a doctor or bachelor Roberto Cuellar. I mean, you have to imagine the courage required to attach your name publicly to a list of military victims during a period of state-sponsored terror. This was foundational. The church wasn't just preaching against injustice, it was actively managing the legal and physical fallout of the violence.
It's fascinating how he balanced this intense, politically charged legal work with his fundamental pastoral duties, community building and spiritual foundation.
Yeah.
We see this so vividly in his diary entry about the confirmation of 40 young people at Maria Auxiliadora on April 7, 1978.
This detail is so essential because it shows the kind of community he was attempting to build, one rooted in evangelical duty, not just social action. When he spoke to those 40 young people, he wasn't talking about political manifestos. He explicitly told them that a community in faith had to be dedicated to the obedience to the doctrine of the apostles.
Okay.
It had to be centered on prayer, fueled by the sacraments, and fundamentally he called it an eschatological community.
That phrase, eschatological community, that's some pretty heavy theological jargon. It might be missed by a casual listener. What do he mean by that in this violent, real-world context?
This is such a profound distinction, and it's one that provided immense resilience. By calling them an eschatological community, he was telling them their ultimate identity and hope wasn't rooted in this temporary, brutal political struggle. It was rooted in the ultimate kingdom of God, the final triumph of the gospel. In practical terms, this gave them a critical source of spiritual resilience against overwhelming despair.
So their suffering, while real, wasn't the final word.
Exactly. Their hope was bigger than the war, which protected their activism from descending into mere despair or revenge.
And this spiritual resilience theme brings us directly to his Paschal message in April 1978. I mean, when you were speaking in a country on the brink of civil war, a country dominated by revolutionary rhetoric, using the word liberation is inherently radical no matter what your intention is.
Precisely. The context meant that every single word was scrutinized by the military, by the opposing bishops, and by the revolutionaries. His homily on the Paschal mysteries centered on liberation.
Liberation.
Christ's redemption from sin, death, hell, and, as he put it, any other slavery.
So he made a point of distinction between the gospel's liberation and the liberation being demanded by revolutionary groups like the BPR.
An absolutely vital distinction. Romero stressed that Christian liberation is more complete and more profound than any other liberation of a merely political, social, or economic type.
And he needed to clarify this for two very different audiences at the same time.
Yes. To the military, he needed to affirm that the church's mission was fundamentally spiritual, to stop them from just outright declaring him a Marxist revolutionary. But to the revolutionaries, he needed to prevent the gospel message from being fully co-opted and reduced to a purely secular political program.
So by defining the spiritual mission as the most comprehensive form of liberation,
he maintained the church's identity as an autonomous moral actor, accountable only to the gospel, and that safeguarded its unique moral voice.
Here's where his diary entries transition from the philosophical to the acutely operational. Just days after that Easter message, he was thrust directly into this incredibly sensitive political negotiation. The dramatic cathedral and embassy occupations on April 12, 1978, carried out by the Bloc Popular Revolucionario, or BPR.
This was a nightmare scenario for any archbishop.
Yeah.
He had to engage directly with the BPR leaders because they were occupying sacred church space, the cathedral, which was also under a police siege.
Right.
So his dialogue with them was pragmatic and protective. He had to ensure they respected the church's autonomy and didn't just use the physical institution for their own political ends.
But didn't he risk being labeled a sympathizer just by offering them any support?
He managed this risk brilliantly through very careful framing. He committed the church to providing assistance, but this commitment was framed explicitly from a Christian Good Samaritan perspective. He insisted they would help any person in need of any color that may be.
So the act of charity was detached from political endorsement?
Exactly. But it still required him to dive into these intense diplomatic negotiations.
And the sources detail him managing negotiations with the BPR Commission and representatives of 4 occupied embassies: Panama, Venezuela, Costa Rica, and Switzerland. What were the specific demands that the BPR was insisting on to end the occupations?
Their core demands were clear and focused on the safety of their base. First, they demanded a peaceful return to their cantons, which crucially required the immediate withdrawal of military forces from those rural areas.
Okay.
Second, freedom for prisoners captured during recent military operations. And third, they required diplomatic pressure from the ambassadors on the Salvadoran president to achieve these goals, and just as importantly, to broadcast the country's true repressive situation to the world.
And Romero pushed incredibly hard for a speedy resolution, didn't he?
He was completely focused on the well-being of the campesinos occupying the sites.
Yeah.
He insisted they needed to rush the definitive resolution because delaying meant one more night of discomfort for the occupants.
Yeah.
He was worried about the coming weekend delaying official formalities.
And the evacuation itself was messy.
Very messy. It happened on April 13th, and Romero immediately expressed deep fear of reprisals against the campesinos once they returned home. His priority was always the physical safety of the most vulnerable individuals involved.
You can feel the tension and the immediate personal danger in those diary entries. It wasn't just diplomatic pressure.
And that pressure was military as well, often wrapped in psychological manipulation. The sources record a fascinating conversation that illustrates the constant danger. A colonel offered Romero a military escort upon leaving the cathedral.
Okay.
The colonel claimed there were credible threats. A bomb, specifically aimed at the archbishop.
That sounds like a genuine threat, but Romero dismissed it. Why?
Romero's reaction was incredibly revealing of his deep political awareness and skepticism. He dismissed the claim as a common exaggeration, a typical tactic used to justify many military actions.
Sure, he thought it was a ploy.
It suggests he did. By accepting a military escort, he would have implicitly endorsed the military's narrative of control and security, and he would have compromised his neutrality. He refused to be co-opted or manipulated by official state gestures, even those disguised as protection. It was a conscious choice to rely on the protection of the people, not the power of the state.
The external political conflict was brutal, but the internal church conflict, it seems to have been almost as devastating for Romero.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's turn now to the deep schism within the Salvadoran Episcopal Conference, known as SEEDS. He was dealing with assassination plots outside and outright rebellion inside the church.
The division was extreme, and it became publicly manifested in April 1978, right after the cathedral occupation. The flashpoint was a document demanding condemnation of priests and religious sisters who had written a critical letter against the papal nuncio.
And Romero refused to sign it.
He refused.
Why was the nuncio the target of the clergy's criticism? And what was Romero's rationale for refusing to condemn his own people?
Well, the nuncio, as the Pope's representative, was seen as aligning too closely with the military regime and the conservative bishops, thereby undermining Romero's pastoral efforts.
Okay.
So Romero insisted that condemning the critical clergy was hasty and unjust. He argued that the nuncio should reflect on his own conduct specifically to give a more Christian testimony. He even pointed to a concrete case, the nuncio's support for a Father Esquivel against the explicit wishes and pastoral line of Esquivel's own bishop.
So for Romero, publishing a condemnation would just formalize the division.
It would formalize and deepen it, especially since he himself wasn't willing to sign it.
And that refusal triggered an explosive confrontation within the SEEDS.
A very passionate meeting followed, as Romero noted in his diary. Bishops Aparicio, Barrera, and Alvarez joined forces in a direct, coordinated attack on his leadership. Their accusations were severe. They claimed Romero's preaching was violent, subversive, that it was dividing both the clergy and the diocese, and that priests were starting to look toward the archdiocese for direction rather than their own bishops.
Which is a charge of institutional insubordination.
Exactly.
I think we need to pause on how damaging this critique was. This wasn't just a disagreement about social action. This was an attack on his orthodoxy and his capacity to govern the diocese.
Exactly. And the attack was intellectualized to give it weight. We see his own auxiliary bishop, Monsignor Ravello, who had been recently appointed, express his inconformity with Romero's line.
And what was Ravello's argument?
It was a sophisticated theological argument. He argued that Romero was not infallible when applying documents from Medellin or the council.
So this created a kind of theological loophole. By claiming the application was flawed, they could dismiss his social justice work as personal political error rather than binding church doctrine, right?
Precisely. It allowed the conservative faction to dismiss the social justice implications of Vatican II and Medellin as merely Romero's political opinion. Ravello suggested clergy had no obligation to agree with the archbishop's line, which eroded Romero's authority and allowed dissenting priests to ignore the archdiocese's pastoral direction with theological cover.
The opposition was not just coordinated, it was cynical.
Romero certainly perceived it that way. He noted with profound resignation that the condemning document they had pressured him to sign was only read once and signed immediately under this passion. He confirmed his immediate suspicion that, in his words, everything was already cooked. This level of intense, public, and coordinated internal betrayal must have been spiritually exhausting, perhaps even more so than the external military threats.
Given this absolute fracture within his own Episcopal Conference, his ad limina visit to the Holy See in June 1978 to present the Archdiocese's pastoral report must have felt less like a routine visit and more like a necessary defense trial.
It was a monumental journey, and the sources show how intensely he prepared. His first act upon arrival wasn't bureaucratic. It was deeply spiritual. He prayed intensely at St. Peter's tomb for two crucial things: the unity of the Church and the success of his dialogue with the Holy See.
He knew the other narrative had already reached Rome.
He knew the dissenting bishops' narratives that painted him as radical and divisive, had gotten there first.
And his initial meetings with the Curia seemed to confirm that the deck was stacked against him.
His meeting with Monsignor Miguel Burro from the Congregation for Bishops was particularly discouraging. Romero noted in his diary that Burro spoke almost exclusively, displaying a series of concepts and prejudices that suggested Burro had already accepted the narrative of the conservative bishops.
So he felt he wasn't being heard.
He was left with very little hope of understanding his pastoral work through this official channel. It really underscored how difficult it was to present his nuanced, complex reality through a system already saturated with opposing viewpoints and Cold War fears.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because he did find a way to cut through that noise and find crucial support.
He did. The pivotal interview was with Cardinal Sebastian Baggio, who was the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops.
And Baggio listened.
Unlike Burro, Baggio listened. Romero documented this meeting privately, believing he successfully managed to debunk much information that is not exact and that, rather, comes from interests contrary to those I try to defend.
So he was able to provide first-hand evidence that countered the accusations.
It seems so. He effectively neutralized the negative campaign against him in the highest echelons of the Church.
And there's also the critical moral and theological support he received from Father Pedro Arrupe.
Yes, Father Arrupe, the Superior General of the Jesuits. He was instrumental. He was described as amply comprehensive of the diverse currents within the global Church. Arrupe encouraged Romero to ensure the Pope was well informed of his intentions directly. But more importantly, Arrupe shared his own experience with bad interpretations of the Jesuits' work.
That solidarity must have been vital.
It was a moral lifeline. It served as a powerful example for Romero to maintain serenity in moments of misunderstanding and difficulty. It was validation from a highly respected institutional figure, basically saying, "You are not alone. We, too, face misunderstanding when we push the boundaries of social justice."
And that external validation gave him the shield he needed to return to El Salvador and continue his line.
With the backing of key figures in Rome, yes.
So let's return to the specific tactical attacks aimed at undermining his leadership, the attempt to delegitimize his influence on the young clergy.
This is a classic tactic in the Cold War era. If you couldn't defeat the Archbishop theologically, you attacked his influence as a radicalizer.
Right.
The sources mentioned Romero lamenting receiving a letter from the Sacred Congregation in April 1978 based on Bishop Aparicio's claims that Romero was to blame for a lack of discipline in the seminary, even for planting leftist ideas among the students.
The implication being that he was actively radicalizing the next generation, turning them into communist sympathizers rather than Catholic priests. That's a grave charge in that political climate.
It is the gravest charge, because it suggests a failure of orthodoxy and a breakdown of institutional control. Romero had to prepare a careful, detailed response to these false accusations in consultation with the seminary fathers, proving that the formation was strictly adhering to orthodox theological requirements while still addressing the social reality of El Salvador.
And this issue became so critical that the Holy See dispatched an envoy to investigate the archdiocese directly.
That was the apostolic visit of Monsignor Corricino.
Right.
Yes. Corricino, who was the Bishop of Vellaneda in Argentina, conducted the visit in late 78, early 79 on behalf of the Holy See. His task was to investigate the archdiocese's pastoral approach, and specifically Romero's strained relationship with his auxiliary bishop, Ravello.
The future of the archdiocese hung on this investigation.
It really did.
So how did the local clergy respond to this external scrutiny? Did they rally around their archbishop?
They provided crucial internal cover. The Presbyterial Senate, The body representing the priests of the archdiocese conducted its own internal sociological and theological survey. Their goal was to establish the true identity of the priesthood under Romero and to validate his pastoral line.
And what did they conclude?
Their key conclusion was a massive defense. They found that Romero's line was simply a continuation of the Reformed tradition started by his predecessor, Monsignor Luis Chavez y Gonzalez. This confirmation meant he was not a radical outlier. He was a traditional pastor responding dynamically to a unique and terrible context. This internal validation was absolutely key to his continued ministry.
The Third General Conference of the Latin American Episcopate in Puebla, Mexico in early 1979 was a global event, a chance to solidify the Church's direction after Medellin. For Romero, it was a moment of profound vindication, but the timing was, well, it was deeply dramatic.
The timing was theater. Romero traveled there in January 1979, carrying the immense weight of his persecuted diocese. His arrival coincided directly with an internationally reported statement from the Salvadoran president, who was also in Mexico, publicly claiming that there was no persecution of the church in El Salvador.
But just before Romero left, one of his priests had been killed.
Exactly. The president's lie was refuted instantly by the living, breathing reality of Romero's presence and the recent tragic death of Father Octavio Ortiz. Romero's sheer physical presence was an immediate, unscripted refutation of the official Salvadoran narrative on a world stage.
How did Romero perceive his own role at the conference? Was he there to fight?
He saw himself as the representative of a diocesan prayer. He carried the testimony of a pastoral line that he profoundly believed was already very much in agreement with what was studied in Puebla.
So he wasn't lobbying for a radical change?
No. He was there to testify that his actions were rooted in the existing, accepted direction of the Latin American Church, the preferential option for the poor.
The conference atmosphere was notoriously difficult, with strong efforts to roll back the social justice commitment of Medellin.
Romero noted this explicitly. He felt the strong pressure from conservative bishops who were desperately trying to pull the final document away from that deep commitment to the poor. The debate was intense, ideological, and focused on interpretation.
But ultimately, the progressive ideals were confirmed.
They were. Romero was reassured that the drafting commission was successfully maintaining the ideals of evangelization, in tune with the demands of our people. The final vote, approving the document by a great majority, was an institutional victory.
And he used that when he returned.
He did. When Romero returned to El Salvador, he used this result as a massive confirmation. He reiterated the themes of Puebla, confirming the congruence of his archdiocese's pastoral line with the conference's conclusions. It meant he was no longer an isolated radical bishop. He was a standard bearer for the regional church.
It is truly staggering to note that this affirmation came at a great ongoing cost. Let's talk about the immediate bloody context surrounding his trip. The killing of Father Octavio Ortiz on January 20th, 1979.
Father Ortiz was killed in a military operation at the El Despertar Christian Formation House. The source emphasizes that he was there with 4 young companions attending a Christian initiation meeting.
So this was a direct, violent attack, not on political agitators,
but on a core, faith-based pastoral activity of the church teaching young people about Christianity.
And Romero's response upon learning the details was swift and had severe theological teeth.
His Mass in the Cathedral for Ortiz was a powerful public act of condemnation and solidarity. He condemned the outrage to the dignity of our church, called for an end to irrational violence, and critically, he recalled the penalty of excommunication for the intellectual and material authors of the crime. This was one of the strongest theological weapons he possessed, declaring that those responsible were outside the communion of the church. It was a clear, dramatic challenge to the state, reminding the Catholic military officers and politicians that their souls were on the line.
Then, just months later, the church suffered another profound loss with the assassination of Father Rafael Palacios in June 1979.
Another deep wound. The funeral was a massive display of clerical unity, attended by at least 60 priests. And Romero chose the funeral mass not just for mourning, but for profound theological reflection on the implications of a priest's murder in that context. He used the solemnity of the occasion to force the church community to look inward.
What specifically did he interpret from the voice of the murdered priest's blood? This sounds like ancient prophetic language.
It is. He saw the blood revealing 3 stark, painful points. First, the mystery of iniquity, which he identified in the unjust structures and sin dominating the country. A clear diagnosis of the systemic failure of the state.
Okay.
Second, the sin of the church itself. And this was the most challenging point. the complicity, or at least the cold doubt and lack of solidarity that many in the hierarchy and some clergy held against reform-minded priests like Palacios. It was an accusation of institutional indifference.
And the third point.
The sanctity of the assassinated priest, the affirmation that his death was a sacrifice for the truth.
The idea that he had to preach about the sin of his own church at a funeral mass is just incredibly poignant.
And this sense of institutional betrayal was compounded by a devastating detail he noted in his diary. Romero expressed a feeling almost of frustration at the coldness with which the death was viewed by some sectors.
Right.
He pointed to the devastating indifference displayed by specific examples, noting that Catholic schools were playing basketball while Father Palacios' corpse lay in state in the cathedral awaiting his funeral mass.
That detail about the basketball game is truly shocking. It reveals the fundamental rift. How did Romero process that betrayal, that indifference from his own institutional community compared to the violence from the military?
I think he processed the violence from the state as predictable, expected behavior from a corrupted system. But the indifference from within the Catholic schools, from the elite families who sent their children there, that was a revelation of the depth of the schism within the church itself. It proved that the preferential option for the poor was not accepted by the powerful sectors who self-identified as Catholic. It showed him that his greatest challenge was not just the military, but the entrenched, comfortable silence of the Catholic bourgeoisie.
The increasing attacks on personnel were inevitably paralleled by attacks on the church's capabilities. Romero understood that his primary strength lay in his ability to bypass the censored media and reach the entire country, primarily through radio.
He absolutely leveraged this technology. He relied heavily on Radio Weissach's La Voz Panamericana to broadcast his extensive Sunday homilies and his crucial social commentary. These broadcasts transformed the station into arguably the most powerful and reliable opposition voice in the entire country.
It was an alternative source of truth.
It was. And the regime, or those aligned with it, knew they couldn't simply kill his voice, so they tried to silence it physically.
That's right.
In February 1980, the repression escalated to direct, coordinated sabotage. A bomb exploded at the Domus Mariae antenna site, completely destroying the Radio Weissach's plant and causing damage to nearby buildings. And simultaneously, another bomb exploded at the UCA library.
Confirming it was a coordinated effort by the extreme right to cripple the church's intellectual and communicative infrastructure in one fell swoop.
Exactly. The message was clear. Silence the Archbishop's voice and the intellectual foundation that supported him.
Here is where the community loyalty truly shone through, contrasting sharply with the coldness he felt after Palacios' death. The people responded to the attack with defiance.
The community response was electrifying. It was a massive moral victory for Romero. When Romero announced the attack on the radio, he had used delayed recordings as the live broadcast capability was destroyed. The public gathered in the basilica, applauded the news of the attack with overwhelming enthusiasm.
Wow.
It was a sign of defiance and shared solidarity. Furthermore, technicians from the UCA, whose library was also attacked, offered to help build a new, even more powerful station.
What a profound repudiation of the bombers.
It was. It demonstrated a clear repudiation of the act and support for our station. The solidarity wasn't just local either. Foreign media, like Radio Noticias del Continente in Costa Rica, offered their shortwave services to ensure his homilies continued to be broadcast intact.
So the attack intended to silence him, but it only amplified his voice.
It absolutely did. This outpouring of tangible support money, labor, international airtime, confirmed the wisdom and effectiveness of his pastoral line.
Let's move to the dramatic political shift in October 1979. An unexpected military insurrection deposed General Carlos Humberto Romero. No relation to the Archbishop, but sharing the same powerful surname, replacing the regime with a military-civilian junta. This event just shattered the political landscape.
It was a moment of immense but fragile hope. Many people, exhausted by the previous regime's brutality, believed this new junta could bring about the necessary reforms.
And Romero.
Archbishop Romero understood that a change was necessary, but he was inherently skeptical of military intentions. His immediate response, delivered in pastoral message, was a very carefully calibrated, conditional support.
That conditional nature must have been his way of avoiding the trap of a premature endorsement. What were the specific conditions he laid out for the new government?
He called on the new junta to demonstrate sincerity by listening genuinely to the poor, acting with justice, and demonstrating true political maturity. But he simultaneously called on the political organizations, meaning the popular movements and the left, to show their own maturity, flexibility, and capacity for dialogue.
He issued a stern warning.
A very stern warning that fanaticism or idolatry of your own party or organization was a grave sin against the common good.
So he was setting the bar high for everyone involved in the transition, demanding a moral revolution, not just a political one.
Exactly. And his conditions were practical points of justice, not abstract ideology. His key demands, which he hammered home as non-negotiable, were accountability for past violence. The government must immediately account for the disappeared and bring the guilty to trial.
Without justice for past crimes, no credibility for future reforms.
None. He even noted the international analysis of his stance, observing that the voice of the United States commented on this judgment as a conditional support, and so it truly was. He offered a chance for a rational, peaceful solution, but only if they proved their sincerity to the victims.
Unfortunately, that fragile hope quickly deteriorated as the new year began. By January 1980, the sources show the country was extremely tense due to division within the government itself.
The civilian members of the junta became deeply convinced that the military element was insincere about implementing real structural change. They felt the military was just using them as a liberal facade. This internal tension culminated in a crucial, tense meeting on January 18, 1980, where Romero was called in to mediate between the military and civilian junta members.
And how did Romero, the mediator, summarize that incredibly tense dialogue?
He spoke of synthesizing three realities. First, the ideal, the revolutionary democratic process they claimed to champion. Second, the difficulties, which included the military ambiguities and other negative aspects that constantly hindered progress. And third, the paths to solution, sincerity, communication, and dialogue.
And he didn't see that sincerity from the military.
Crucially, no. He noted he saw the military as unwilling to clearly define themselves in favor of the full, genuine proclamation of the popular demands.
This lack of sincerity led directly to the collapse of the civilian involvement, which was devastating for the prospect of peaceful change.
It was the death knell of the reformist government. Civilian ministers began resigning in protest, including highly respected figures like Hector Dada and Roman Mayorga Quiros, who had been a member of the junta itself.
And their warning was explicit.
Explicit and chilling. The Christian Democrat presence in the government was merely serving to shelter an underlying and continuing reality of repression and military power. They argued the new junta was simply the old regime in new clothes, using democratic faces for cover. Despite this erosion of confidence, in March 1980, the government made one last desperate attempt to win back national and international legitimacy by promulgating key socioeconomic legislation.
This created what you could call the monumental reform paradox. On March 6, 1980, the government promulgated the Agrarian Reform Law and the nationalization of banks, massive structural changes that had been demanded by the people for decades.
No.
But here's the paradox. They simultaneously declared a state of siege immediately after passing these reforms.
Why do both at once? That seems completely self-defeating. It was a cynical political calculation driven by desperation. They needed the reforms to gain international aid and legitimacy, especially from the U.S. and Europe, who demanded democratic gestures. But they also knew that implementing a massive agrarian reform would necessarily generate violent internal opposition from the powerful landowners and the military elite.
So to manage that opposition,
They felt they needed the total repressive power of the state of siege.
and Romero saw right through this contradiction.
He was unequivocal. He approved the good elements of the reforms. He couldn't, in good conscience, condemn the agrarian reform itself, as it was a historical necessity, but he immediately warned of their absolute inefficacy because the terrible repression was continuing.
Right.
His central insight was that the ongoing violence negated the promised benefits and destroyed public trust. The people could not believe in a government offering sweeping economic reforms while simultaneously offering relentless repression and murder. The state of siege rendered the agrarian reform illegitimate in the eyes of the people it was meant to help.
Romero's conscience eventually drove him to intervene directly on the international stage, taking on the biggest external player, the United States. This move drastically raised the stakes of his ministry.
This was the moment of no return. The main controversy stemmed from a letter addressed directly to the U.S. president, which Romero read aloud in a homily in February 1980. The letter warned against the imminent danger posed by military aid to El Salvador. He asked the U.S. not to send the aid, arguing it would only support the repressive forces.
That is an extraordinary intervention for an archbishop to make. What was the underlying threat he perceived that justified challenging U.S. foreign policy so publicly?
He was concerned about a new concept of war he observed on the ground, which he called a particular war. He defined this war not as a classic anti-insurgency effort, but as consisting of homicidally eliminating all the efforts of popular organizations under the pretext of communism or terrorism.
So he saw U.S. military aid fueling a systematic, murderous campaign against organized dissent.
Any organized dissent, be it campesino unions, student groups, or even elements of the church, regardless of whether that dissent was truly communist or simply poor people organizing for their rights, he felt the U.S. was underwriting genocide.
This action dramatically increased the threats against him, although the source notes the initial, confusing threat came from the opposite side.
The threat context was incredibly volatile. In November 1979, before the U.S. aid controversy, Romero received a confidential warning from the nuncio of Costa Rica, citing a trustworthy source, indicating a threat against his life from the extreme left.
The extreme left, why?
The supposed goal was cynical: to destabilize the new junta by assassinating a key moral figure and blaming it on the military. Romero acknowledged the seriousness, but maintained prudence without exaggeration, refusing to let the threats dictate his movements.
But the bombing of his radio station and the UCA library a few months later suggests the source of the immediate danger had shifted back to the right.
Absolutely. After the homily criticizing U.S. aid in February 1980 and the subsequent coordinated bombing of church property, the context shifted. These high-level acts of sabotage were clearly the work of the extreme right, indicating that while he was navigating the rhetoric of threats from all sides, his most immediate existential peril stemmed from his moral opposition to the state's violence and its powerful international backers.
He became the central obstacle to the conservative elite's plan for total control.
He was.
The deep divisions and betrayals he suffered internally contrast so sharply with the international recognition he was receiving for his stand. While his own bishops plotted against him, the world saw him as a moral giant.
The world saw him as the quintessential voice of conscience in Latin America. The diary entries detail active, massive international appreciation. This included the announcement in April 1979 that a committee pro-Nobel Prize for Human Rights in El Salvador was actively working on his nomination.
Wow. And this was long before he became globally famous.
Yes, demonstrating the early recognition of the profound risk he was undertaking.
And the academic world provided intellectual recognition as well.
He was awarded an honorary doctorate, Dr. Honoris Causa, by the prestigious University of Louvain in Belgium in February 1980. This wasn't merely a polite gesture. It was a formal commendation of his intellectual capacity and his social work. He was invited to deliver the main address on the vital topic of faith and politics, which allowed him to articulate his pastoral line that faith must inform public life to a global intellectual audience.
He also received tangible ecumenical support, which was critical given the Catholic Church schism.
In January 1980, he was informed that Catholic and free churches in Sweden would award the Archdiocese a Peace Prize. This was important not only for the symbolic honor ecumenical support for a Catholic archbishop in that era was rare, but also because it included a financial contribution for the needy, demonstrating tangible financial solidarity with the suffering people he served.
So this external affirmation provided both moral and material resources that offset the opposition he faced at home.
It did. It must have been a great comfort.
Despite the overwhelming opposition and the constant threats, Romero never stopped attempting to unify the fragmented Salvadoran clergy and hierarchy. He was trying to heal the wounds before the violence engulfed them all.
His commitment to unity was relentless and pastorally driven. For instance, in January 1980, he convened a dialogue with priests to address concerns about the excessive politicization of some members of the clergy. His aim was always to bring them back to the Church's transcendental identity, to ensure they were authentic signs of the kingdom of God amid the political chaos, not merely political operatives wearing clerical collars.
And the institutional intervention from the Holy See in early 1980s shows that the Vatican was finally acknowledging the severity of the divisions the conservative bishops had created.
Yes, this was a massive vindication. In February 1980, the Holy See declared the recent election of the president of the Episcopal Conference Sedes invalid.
A clear rebuke.
A clear rebuke of the faction that had opposed Romero. The Vatican ordered the bishops to hold a new election, but only after engaging in a required period of reflection and prayer, signaling that unity had to be forged on sincere pastoral grounds, not political maneuvering.
We see Romero making one of his final structural changes in March 1980, focusing on Caritas, the charity wing of the Archdiocese.
This move, made just weeks before his assassination, is incredibly telling about his priorities. He appointed a new commission to organize Caritas. He wanted to ensure that the institution fulfilled its core mission as a school at the service of the promotion of charity and love.
He was worried it was becoming too bureaucratic.
He was concerned that it might focus only on existing programs, rather than embodying the radical spirit of Christ's charity, which demands structural change. His final institutional act was a recommitment to the fundamental mission of love and service to the poor.
The sources trace a trajectory from a quiet, conservative man to a defiant, martyred prophet. Romero, the pastor of God, transformed himself into a symbol of liberty, of hope, a hope that remains strong and efficacious even today. By refusing to be silent, he turned himself into a sacrificial victim, whose ultimate act sought to stop the devastating civil war at its deadly inception.
His enduring power lies in the simplicity and constancy of his message. It was a ceaseless exhortation to peace, to the respect of human rights, and to sincere dialogue in a country completely disoriented by conflict. The diaries confirm that he was the voice of a country ravaged by violence, constantly challenging any political solution, whether offered by the extreme right or the revolutionary left, that lacked a fundamental foundation of justice and accountability. He warned consistently that only a genuine structural change in the social, economic, and political order could possibly deter the escalating bloodshed.
It is so important to remember that this path cost him everything, but it was a choice rooted in duty and spiritual clarity. As he prepared for one of his key high-stakes interviews in Rome, a Cardinal Secretary of State gave him a piece of advice that seems to be the ultimate summation of Romero's life and mission. The Cardinal reminded him that the Church must proceed not by pleasing the powers of the earth, but according to its faith and its conscience in the gospel.
That phrase captures the core dilemma of moral leadership in a crisis. He had to disappoint the powers of the earth, the military, the oligarchs, the U.S. government, in order to adhere to the gospel.
So we leave you with this provocative thought to consider long after this deep dive ends. Romero's story forces us to measure the price of speaking truth against the cost of remaining silent in the face of widespread injustice. What does true, authentic adherence to conscience, that quiet internal voice, cost you when competing political ideologies or economic systems demand your compliance, your obedience, or ultimately your silence?